Today we're using infrared photography to turn scenes like this into this. It's all in today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everyone, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions. Don't forget to go to AskDavidBergman.com. Ask your own photo questions on that site. I just might answer it right here on a future show. Also, hopefully you're already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel. If not, go ahead and click that button down below. Use the little bell so you get notifications of all the great photo shows that come out all week long just for you right here on Adorama TV. Today's question came in from Byron B, and he wants to know, how would you use the Hoya R72 infrared filter? Is there a lot of post-processing involved? Infrared photography, we're talking about that cool artsy style of photography that has a really ethereal look where dark leaves and foliage turn bright and white and the sky can get much darker. Now, infrared light, what is it? It's outside of the visible spectrum. In other words, we just can't see it. What we're talking about in wavelengths is somewhere between 700 nanometers to about 900 nanometers. That's the near infrared spectrum is what that's called. The far infrared spectrum is used for thermal imaging and not what we're talking about today. Also, I'm not going to go too far down the scientific rabbit hole here. You can look up what the terms mean and exactly what infrared light is, but I'm going to talk about how it works in photography. There are really two traditional ways to create IR infrared images with digital cameras. The first one is to have your camera modified, to actually modify the camera. The digital camera sensors are, by default, they are sensitive to infrared light. But if all that IR light got through and hit your sensor, it would mess with the camera in a lot of ways. The exposure would be off. The meters wouldn't really be able to read the exposure properly. Focus might be off a bit. The colors definitely wouldn't be right. So what happens is the cameras today all have an IR blocking filter inside to cut out most of that infrared light. Now, you can have the camera actually modified to remove or replace that IR filter. Now, I personally have never had it done, but there are a lot of options and things to consider if you were going to do it. Really the main thing to know about it, though, is that camera modification, it's one way. It is a one-way trip. You can't use that camera once it's been modified normally. After you've done that conversion, that's it. That's now your IR camera. So obviously, it's not something you're going to do with your primary camera. If you have an old camera body, maybe that you don't use anymore, or you want to have it converted, you certainly could. It is possible to do on your own. I think it's risky. It's really complex. There are guides that you can download online that will show you how to do it. If you're into that kind of thing, some people like to do that. I personally would never try it. If I was going to have it done, there are companies online that you can go ahead and look up, and they will do it to your camera, or in some cases they can sell you one that's already been modified. There are different types of IR filters that they can replace it with that are gonna, different, when they replace that IR filter, there are different ways they can do it that are gonna give you different looks. So there are a lot of options to have it done. It's gonna cost you a few $100s for the conversion, plus the cost of the camera if you were buying the camera, obviously. Now, Byron, you asked about the Hoya R72 infrared filter. That filter is right here. The filter itself looks like this. It's a traditional screw-on filter, just like you would buy for a neutral density or a polarizer or anything like that, with a couple of differences. Of course, you have to buy the correct size for your camera. So, for example, for the lens, this is the Canon 5D Mark IV. With the 16-35 f4 on it. It's got a 77 millimeter filter thread on the front. So the one that I have is the 77 millimeter Hoya. These things cost about 80 or 90 bucks. So it's definitely a lot less expensive than having your camera modified. So it's sort of an easier way to go. Of course, also you can take it off. So you can use your camera as a traditional camera and then just put this on when you want to play around with this type of IR photography. Now, how does this filter actually work? What the R72 is, it blocks out light with a wavelength under 720 nanometers. So that's why it's called the R72. Now, only the infrared light is going to be passing through that filter, but because the camera still also has the IR blocking filter in there, there's really only a small amount of IR light that's going to get through all the way through to the sensor. So this filter, as you can see, is very dark, right? I can hold it actually up to this bright light right here, and I can't see through it at all, right? And that's should be obvious because the visible light is being blocked. That's kind of the whole point of it. So the challenge is you're going to need to use really long shutter speeds, often 30 seconds or more. You're obviously going to be on a tripod, and if you do have your camera converted, you're not going to have that same issue because they're actually replacing that IR filter instead of just adding more elements that are going to block light. So you'll be able to shoot traditional shutter speeds if you have the camera converted, but when you use this R72, you're going to be stuck using very, very long shutter speeds. Now, yesterday I went into Central Park and I wanted to photograph the Bow Bridge. Let's go here into Capture One, and you can actually see my traditional image right here that I made without the filter on there. No problem, right? You can see my settings. I'm at ISO 400, 200th of a second shutter speed at f7.1. Now, to use that R72, you have to compose and focus first before you put the filter on. It's very much like using a neutral density, although I believe it's even darker than a neutral density. So once you put that filter on, you can't see through the camera. You cannot see anything. Literally, it's a black frame. So you need to get all those things set beforehand, focus and composition. So I was on a Manfrotto Befree tripod with a ball head, locked down on the ground as low as I could get to the water using the nice horizontal column on that thing. And then what I did was I'm using a 2-minute exposure, and I was using the bulb mode with cable release, and I could see the timer counting on the Canon 5D Mark II as I was shooting. Now, of course, I'm going to shoot raw because the colors are going to need to be adjusted after the fact. And the way the R72 works is it has a red tint, so the images are going to be red. And you can see here's the traditional photo, and then when I switch, there is the image I got straight out of camera with that filter. The long exposure, 2-minute exposure, gives the water a really ethereal look, just like a neutral density filter would do, because the water is moving, and so it gives it that sort of smoothness, but also it's not a really clean reflection of the bridge because the water was a bit choppy. So this is how it's going to look with that filter straight out of camera. Now, as for post-processing, there are some traditional ways to process IR images, since IR light doesn't actually have any color, right? It's outside of the visible light, visible spectrum that we can see. So there's really no color. So one of the easiest ways to go ahead and work with these IR images is just to convert to black and white. I love to use Silver Effects Pro from DxO. Basically, if you just go ahead and load that up in there, it looks like that, right? And go ahead and throw an artsy border on there and you're done. And it's kind of a nice, interesting image. It looks a lot different than just a traditional image converted to black and white, although in programs like Silver Effects, you can apply different colored filters, red filters, and so on that are going to make it look similar to an IR look, but it's not quite exactly the same as if you captured it that way. Now, if you want to make the image color, it's a bit trickier, but it's kind of a lot of fun. You can totally play around with it, and really there are no rules because IR doesn't have color, actual color like we're used to. So you can really play around with it. When people talk about traditional IR image processing, they're usually referred to false color, where basically red and blue are reversed. The red channels and the blue channels are flipped. I prefer, maybe just because I don't do this a lot and don't have a lot of experience, I just prefer to kind of play around with it and just see what looks good. What I'm going to do, let's go in here back to Capture One, and I can show you the original image. And the main thing I'm going to do here is use this click white balance. And I'm going to go ahead and click on what I think should be white. So maybe let's look at this bright foliage here and go ahead and click. And just right away, you can see kind of that cool IR look. And that works pretty nicely. You can click around and try different places. If I go into the sky, it's going to be more blue because it's going to make the sky a little bit more white and neutral. I can try to click down here on the water that's blue and neutralize that color, and then you can see how the sky gets yellow, and the foliage absolutely is brighter than it would be in real life. It almost looks like it's covered in snow, right? So gives it a really cool look. Now, again, there are really not many rules here. I went ahead and played around for a while and created this image. And this is my final image. I messed around. I did there's a little vignette. I darkened the rocks here a little bit, up the contrast, did a bunch of things, but really I didn't have to do that much to make it look that wild. So it's definitely a fun thing to play around with. I made a 17x22 print that looks amazing. Nice little border on it, and it looks great. So definitely a fun thing to play around with. This Hoya R72, is this right for you? Well, I say why not? It's a super fun way to just play around with some quirky looks. Obviously, it's going to be best for landscapes since you have to use long shutter speeds. You're going to be on a tripod. If you want to make portraits or pictures of anything that moves with an IR look to it, then you're really going to have the camera converted, because that way you can use regular shutter speeds. And by the way, skin looks really weird in IR. It gets very white. Eyes get black. It's very bizarre how IR light reflects off of different things, but absolutely fun to experiment with and play around. Hey, do you guys shoot IR images? How do you do it? Let me know in the comments below. Send me links to pictures if you've got them. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Adorama YouTube channel. Again, go to AskDavidBergman.com if you have your own photo questions. I am back here every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern with a brand new question. Hope to see you here next week at Ask David Bergman.